oh my God, the coronavirus is going to destroy society as we know it. When we come out of this quarantine, nothing will be the same. All right, everyone, calm down. Chances are better than average that the social world that you know and love will more or less be just the way you left it when you finally started taking the quarantine seriously and batten down the hatches. How do I know? Well, I know that because I'm a sociologist, and that's pretty much what a society is for, providing stable and predictable environments. Look, sociologists recognize that structures that exist in society, institutions, organizations, communities, networks, are all functional. Social structures are made of the norms and resources that are needed to organize everyday life. Imagine if every day you went out and interacted with people, you had to renegotiate the rules of interaction. Imagine if every day you got up, you had no idea how the world was going to work. Human life would be impossible under those conditions. Now, we can quibble about some of the details, and believe me, sociologists love to quibble about details, but nonetheless, sociologists largely accept the thesis that social structures are in place to ensure continuity, and those structures don't break easily. For the most part, institutions like to remain just the way they are, and they minimize the amount of change that they're willing to go through. Disruptions in how institutions work tend to be short-term. There may be some minor adjustments, but when the initial disruption is resolved, life goes back to normal. So let's take an example. Schools. Education is a major institution in society, and schools are the organizations that fulfill that function. Since the beginning of public education, kids went to school. They went to a building in which professionals imparted unto them an education, and then students came home, and but for some homework, the education part of their day was over. Now, with social distancing, school districts across the country are, in essence, reinventing education almost overnight. As a public school teacher, I'm involved in this endeavor myself. It's massive and full of a lot of trial and error, learning new skills, improvising new technologies. It's quite the challenge. Instead of being there for my students to help them with new concepts that are unclear to them, I now have to create materials that allow them to clarify the concepts on their own, and then offer input via communication infrastructure. Massive endeavors have been put into place to ensure that all students have access to online services, computers, word processing programs. This has really been huge, and not without its problems and inequalities. On one hand is the changes we've had to put into place. We've had to expand our communication infrastructure, adopt software that helps us communicate with our students. We've had to develop more self-directed curriculum, take more of a supportive role, while students who are left to work through their own education. We've had to become more flexible with regard to how we grade and how strictly we enforce due dates. The concepts of instructional time and moving from classroom to classroom, bells set to go off at different times, has completely gone out the window. Students and teachers are, for the most part, self-pacing. Furthermore, stuff that we used to spend a lot of time on and energy on, like standardized testing, we've abandoned. Turns out, those all-important tests weren't really that important after all. Imagine that. In the face of these changes, we have to ask ourselves if we literally created and implemented these massive changes in just a couple of weeks. Why couldn't we have put them in place years ago? Why couldn't we ensure that every student had access to Wi-Fi years ago? Why couldn't we create self-guided curricula years ago? Why not be more flexible with norms like due dates and instructional time? Why do we have to force students to sit in classrooms based on the time of day and then penalize them when they don't conform? We've known for 100 years that kids learn at their own pace, but yet we still set the pace for them and punish them when they don't do what we know some of them can't do. At the same time, students who can complete our curriculum in less than the time allotted are often required to remain in our classes for the full 180 days, whether they need it or not. We know we can teach without these constraints, yet it's taken a global pandemic to challenge the constraints of modern education. So will social distance learning replace brick and mortar schools and constitute an educational revolution? It would be nice, but I wouldn't hold my breath. Social structures demand a certain continuity. For instance, a great deal of time and energy is being put into maintaining traditional norms of schooling. Attendance is a great example. We have some great software for keeping attendance, which is entirely meaningless when students are no longer technically attending in the traditional sense. Yet we've spent a lot of time and energy trying to make our norms about attendance fit the traditions in the face of reality. We have to figure out ways to keep attendance records because those records go to the state and justify our funding. Furthermore, once social distancing is done and we return to the brick and mortar buildings, our structures will be shaped by our physical reality. We will go back to periodic class times and physical classrooms with those miserable one-armed desks. We will complain about overcrowded classrooms and dress codes and lectures and homework because that's how the structures are set up. Maybe individual teachers will change their personal approaches in some way based on the lessons they learned during the pandemic. And maybe those practices will become habituated and reified within education over time. Maybe we'll see educational reformers buoyed by the lessons of social distancing who can make a credible claim to change over time. Both of those changes, however, will take some time to institutionalize because social structures don't like to change. It's also significant to point out that much of the changes happening in education are built on structures that already existed before the pandemic. Schools didn't invent new technologies to create distant learning. No, they made use of existing technologies that have already been developed. School districts like mine that had already invested heavily in technology transitioned fairly well. Other districts had to catch up. Teachers didn't reinvent curriculum delivery. We're innovating the stuff we already know about education. If anything, the changes we're putting into place are more of an acceleration of changes that were already happening than they are innovations of new social norms and rituals, and it's likely this is the pattern that holds true for most other institutions. Some innovations are being put into place, often for the sake of maintaining continuity of the social structures. What changes do stick will take some time to become integral to the social structure, and these changes will most likely be accelerations of changes already underway. Again, this is almost certainly the pattern for most institutions. That being said, if the structural trends that existed before the coronavirus are negative and they accelerate, that could be a bad sign. Economist Paul Krugman pointed out in the New York Times at the time I'm putting this video together that democracy itself is at risk. The example he offers is how Hungary's de facto dictator Viktor Orban is using the coronavirus to consolidate his power and rule by edict. Indeed, democracy has been on a downward trend for the last decade. That would-be autocrats might use the coronavirus lockdown to lock down their own power certainly doesn't seem unreasonable. Anti-immigration xenophobia is another trend that could increase. Racism has a long association with disease. There's a thin line between closing borders to viruses and closing borders to ethnicities and marginalized refugees. At the same time, pro-democratic movements have also been ascendant, from Occupy Wall Street 10 years ago to the massive Hong Kong protests this last year. Democratic movements are coalescing and organizing in the face of increasing right-wing authoritarianism and political power grabs. Might the coronavirus help to accelerate popular democracy? It's hard to say. That's especially true when it comes to significant paradigm shifts. Paradigms are basically the stories we tell about ourselves and our social world. When social commentators and reformers talk about paradigm shifts, they're saying that something has happened that is so drastic that it alters our perceptions of ourselves and the world. 9/11 was supposed to have created such a paradigm shift, and to a certain extent it did. We became aware of our own vulnerability, and that resulted in increased anger toward peoples we identified as threatening. On the other hand, much as I described for education, 9/11 only served to accelerate trends that were already in place. Furthermore, it entrenched paradigms of American hegemony and the importance of unquestioned military dominance for the United States. Those structures had been around since World War II. So the extent to which 9/11 is a paradigm shift is up for debate. What isn't up for debate is that eventually life returned to normal with some limited innovations. Now we're hearing similar claims about coronavirus. On the left, I see colleagues predicting the end of the neoliberal world order. That might be nice. On the right, I'm seeing concern that stay-at-home orders and trillion-dollar aid packages are the first step to the Stalinist totalitarian state they've all feared since the founding of the John Birch Society. Chances are pretty good that neither of these outcomes will result, and such thinking often gives birth to conspiracy theories suggesting that secret forces are conspiring to create COVID-19 for the sake of ending the neoliberal world order or creating a Stalinist global hegemony or some such nonsense. Now, paradigm shifts do happen, but usually not in the ways we think. The advent of the Black Plague is a good example of a global pandemic bringing a paradigm shift in European society. Ultimately, the Black Plague dismantled the feudal order of vassalage and caused a breakdown in moral and religious values, straining the legitimacy of the Roman Catholic Church. Furthermore, the loss of labor encouraged the expansion of a wage labor system and inspired new technological innovations that became the foundation of the Industrial Revolution. A more modern comparison is the Spanish flu epidemic starting in 1918. At that time, there was a significant paradigm shift changing the mindsets of an entire generation and setting the stage for the late modern period. By the 1920s, many Western cultures seemed to abandon their faith in human progress that had been the hallmark of the Enlightenment and embraced a more cynical view of the human condition as being nihilistic and existential. Moral values premised on human improvement and invention took a backseat to situational morality and the exaltation of living for the moment. This paradigm shift reinforced the rise of consumer capitalism that continues to shape the modern world. It also popularized an attitude of skepticism of our leading institutions, also an influential mindset today. Direct comparisons, however, are hard to make based on these historical examples. Yes, the Black Plague did cause Western society to question its values and the authorities who represented those values, yet people suffering from the plague had no other way to understand what was happening to them. They knew that if they followed the tenets of the Roman Catholic Church, that they would be blessed in the eyes of God. That was clearly not the case. Once the bodies started piling up without regard to personal piety, alternative narratives had to take place. Some became even more zealously devout to the point of public self-flagellation. Others became cynical and questioned the theocratic order. Yet the church continued to have a great deal of power, and the changes resulting from the plague took many decades, even centuries, to manifest. Things happened much quicker after the Spanish flu. This is likely due to the fact that communication happened much faster in the 20th century than it did in the 15th, a phenomenon that validates Durkheim's concept of social density. But this disease took place in the context of another catastrophe, namely World War I. It's impossible to disentangle the impacts of the virus from the impacts of the war by which it traveled. Spanish flu was a catastrophe on top of a catastrophe. Is that what it takes to create a paradigm shift? So, our historical examples muddy the waters a bit when it comes to the expectations of major paradigm shifts, such changes in human mindset are messier than they seem upon studying history. Why? It seems common sense that something as drastic as a global pandemic or a world war would surely cause a drastic and immediate changes to human society. But even our most extreme examples seem to contradict this. What's going on? A lot of this has to do with how institutions organize power. This has a lot to do with a theoretical project that I'm currently working on. To my memory, this video is the first open iteration of my theoretical framework that draws on a number of classical and contemporary sociological traditions. The best way to understand institutions is as conveyances of human power. Institutions and organizations have no power in and of themselves. Power is the result of human exertion. This is what I call foundational power. Institutions become powerful by incorporating this foundational power towards some socially legitimate end. They do this in a couple of ways. The most obvious is what I call external motivators. That is, institutions provide material incentives or coercion in order to incorporate human power. So you may not want to go to work on Monday, but you like your house and you want to pay your mortgage, and to do that, you need money. To get money, you have to work. Is that an incentive, or is that a coercion? Well, yes. It doesn't really matter. It's still an external motivator. The problem is that external motivators are hard to sustain by themselves. It either requires lots of resources or lots of violence. To mitigate this, institutions use what I call internal motivators. In other words, the institution creates paradigms or discourses that legitimize its existence. In other words, they tell stories about their own legitimacy in society. Those people who accept the story are then more likely to use their foundational power in the interest of the institution's goals. In short, institutions construct knowledge. So, as you can see, this theory draws from theoretical tradition set by Max Weber and social construction theory, as well as the work of French theorist Michel Foucault on power, knowledge, and biopower. I don't want to get into the weeds of the theory. Someday I'll finish my book. Now, there are some rules with regard to how external and internal motivators are used to structure foundational power. I call them the 3 laws of institutions. I call them that mostly because it's sarcastically presumptuous for sociologists to speak in terms of laws of social processes. First, the primary function of any institution is to perpetuate itself. All other expressed functions are at best secondary. Institutions do this by using external and internal motivators to incorporate foundational power to further their goals. That leads to the second law. Institutions try to empower themselves as much as they can. The more people they can get incorporated into the institution, the more powerful they are. Finally, the third law. Institutions must compete with other institutions in a social environment to which they must adapt. After all, individuals only have so much time and energy to give to any particular institution. That's a limiting factor in the institutional environment. So any changes that happen will take place in terms of this third law. What happens when the lived experience of everyone in a given society flies in the face of the internal motivators, the stories that institutions tell about themselves, to the point where the very legitimacy of the institutions guiding society are questioned? Back during the Black Plague, the all-encompassing institution was the Roman Catholic Church. But with so many people dying of the plague, even the most devout, it was difficult for the church to continue to tell its story about salvation and the blessings of God available to believers. After World War I, when millions of people were slaughtered by supposedly civilized nations using scientific precision, people became skeptical of the human capacity to be civilized and the moral progress promised by science. The good intent and expertise of the leadership of modern nation-states premised on paradigms of legal, rational order was no longer so convincing. So if my theory is valid, and I think it is, though admittedly I'm still working through the details, remember, sociologists love to dicker about details, then that means whatever changes happen resulting from the coronavirus pandemic will depend on how this virus challenges the dominant stories that define the legitimacy of our major institutions, how we as human beings respond to these stories, and how institutions adapt by adjusting their external and internal motivators. Even after the Black Plague, the church remained powerful. Even after World War I, the political economy of the liberal world order remained intact, if subject to greater skepticism. So what are the dominant legitimizing stories subject to challenge? Well, that will require some digging. It's complicated. There's lots of stories out there, each one vying for attention. First, let's take a look at the more personal stories about how we interact with the people most intimate to us. It's unlikely that those stories are going to change much. Once this pandemic is over and the necessity for social distance passes, much of the everyday rituals and interactions that we have with our peers, friends, family, co-workers will go back to normal. Yeah, we may be more consciously aware of the hygiene behind how we interact. We may wash our hands more, fist bump instead of shaking hands, think twice before entering crowded elevators, at least for a while, but most of the interpersonal rituals we perform will remain. We will embrace again. We will shake hands again. I don't see face masks becoming a significant fashion accessory. The thing is that social distance is simply antithetical to human behavior. Human contact, human closeness, human touch, these are things that are absolutely necessary to human health and well-being. That being said, we may have learned a thing or two about social closeness in the face of social distancing that may be incorporated into our everyday lives. Like many of you watching this video, I took social contact for granted. I could always just get in my car, visit my family, or have dinner with my friends anytime I wanted. But I didn't. It wasn't a premium because it was always an option. Now I can't. How might this change how I approach my relationships in the future? How about the norms and values of your household, the stories you tell about your own relationships? How may they have changed to compensate for the fact that you're at home all the time, with the same people, all the time? For most of you, some of the rules have changed. Maybe you've rediscovered family game time or dinners, home cooking rather than going to the restaurant. You're using FaceTime and Skype more often. Maybe there'll be a boom of quarantine babies 10 months from now. On the other hand, not all families and households are healthy. What about those who live alone? What about those who live in abusive households? What will be the emotional and psychological toll? Maybe some in an abusive situation may learn that living with that abuse is intolerable and we'll see an increase in divorces. Maybe they might be inclined to do something about the situation in which they're living. Unfortunately, studies on domestic abuse all indicate that social isolation is a factor in domestic abuse. Social distancing might just exacerbate this. Culturally, however, we're learning an interesting lesson about isolation versus solitude. This has been of particular interest to me as a teacher and a sociologist for some time now. For the last few years, contemporary society has been dealing with a paradox. I place this paradox in the category of social schizophrenia, a condition by which the social constructs are inadequate for contradict the lived reality. Here's the paradox. In the face of social media and modern computer networking, people rarely ever have solitude. We're always networked, always reachable. Furthermore, we even feel obligations to be accessible all the time. The cognitive research being done makes clear that solitude is absolutely necessary for mental health and well-being. We all need at least some time alone with our thoughts and our internal dialogue. On the other hand, despite not having solitude, the shallow nature of our constant interactions doesn't necessarily equate to quality human contact, meaning we often find ourselves feeling socially isolated. Research is also clear that quality human contact is also absolutely necessary for mental health and well-being, and isolation is devastating to human identity. Our current social distancing puts this paradox into sharp contrast and does offer us an opportunity to negotiate a balance between solitude and isolation. We can also predict that everyday elements of our lives might change. Basic concepts that are incorporated into our vernacular may be up for renegotiation. Think about it. We take for granted that we go to work or go to school. Work or school is in some ways more where we go than what we do. Coronavirus may change that perception. Will your bosses decide that based on their bottom lines, it's possible to keep more workers in their homes and cut the overhead of having to provide them a physical plant to work in? Indeed, the economic recession that will probably result from social distancing may incentivize such a strategy. And many workers are perfectly happy doing their work without the burden of, wearing pants. Historian Sean Munger, in his video on how COVID-19 will change the world, offers an interesting premise of how this will change our economy, as fewer workers are needed to sustain fewer workplaces. Investments in real estate will be challenged. Oil prices, already precipitously low, will further collapse as the two-way trek to and from work becomes unnecessary for more workers. Hey, I haven't driven my vehicle in a week. And not all of the changes will be bad. Less driving means less smog. Fewer physical plants means reduced urban sprawl. Lower land costs means the opportunity for more public spaces and affordable housing, which means political opportunities for interest groups interested in these things. So there could be some serious economic changes in sight, but does this constitute a major paradigm shift? Does the validity of neoliberal capitalism collapse? Are we on the precipice of creating a more just and equitable political economy, or are we on the verge of building a totalitarian state? So let's talk about the political economy. First, in modern nation states, the political economy is the most powerful because it incorporates everyone in the society, but it doesn't incorporate everyone evenly. There are interest groups, political parties, businesses, labor unions, consumers, cultural subgroups. These are all organized and institutionalized to play in the government and the market of a given society. Within any given society, you have an elite group, those at the top, who direct the external and internal motivators of the dominant institutions, and what I call the demos, or those who do the work or exercise their foundational power to sustain these institutions. The state is a special institution that serves as an interstice between an economic elite and the demos. Most often the state serves as a bulwark in the interests of the elite, but sometimes the state must serve as a chief negotiator when the demos becomes especially difficult to motivate. As elaborated by C. Wright Mills, the elite of the modern political economy in most advanced nations is the corporate elite, the major investors and board members of our top corporations. They, according to Mills, support and often staff the national echelons of the state, and the state in turn serves the interests of the board members. The board members, however, have a vested interest in social stability, as that's the source of their profits. When society becomes unstable, it's up to the state to restore order. When dealing with millions of people, this is usually done through negotiation rather than coercion. For decades now, especially in the United States, the dominant story of our political economy has been one of government incompetence and market godliness. The balm for all that ails us is capitalism, markets, free and unrestrained, profit motive, greed is good. Government investment in public goods is seen as a waste of resources on the undeserving that must be paid for by the job creators, who will then in turn not create jobs for those who are hardworking and thus deserving of more money. Now, it's clear this isn't true. For decades under this particular institutional stories, corporations have prospered like never before, but everyday people find it harder and harder to get by and to live a median standard of living without working multiple jobs and extending their credit lines. Social safety nets are frayed, public investments in healthcare and education have dried up, and costs to consumers have skyrocketed. Now, some interest groups are premised on the story that capitalism can be reformed to even out the wrinkles. Some go as far as to tell the story that capitalism is simply not good enough and must be replaced. However, the dominant story, the one that gets the power, is the story that all we need is more capitalism. And if capitalism isn't working, it's because of incompetent government and those people, namely immigrants and the lazy poor, often represented as people of color, putting a drain on the system. This story is largely the premise of what we call neoliberalism. Neoliberalism has largely won out as the dominant political economic motivator for the better part of my lifetime, much to my chagrin. But this story has become more and more untenable in the last 10 years. First, the discourse of God capitalism has been stretched thin by rising inequality and stagnating economies for all but the top echelons of earners and wealth holders. Secondly, the neoliberal paradigm was shattered by the Great Recession and the resulting bailouts for the investment class. Tremendous mobilization on the part of corporate-funded political investments, interest groups, and media platforms was required to hold the crumbling edifice of neoliberalism together, but it worked. Now coronavirus is demonstrating the inadequacy of state-supported capitalism as a cure-all for our social ills. In the face of a virus that sends the demos home to socially isolate, capitalism is simply unsustainable. Look at how the nation responded to the guy who bought up all the hand sanitizer and tried to sell it for a profit. He was soundly condemned because, it turns out, greed isn't good. But he wasn't doing anything that wasn't in line with Capitalism 101. Here's New York Governor Cuomo talking about capitalism making the situation worse for his citizens.
But look at the bizarre situation we wind up in. Every state does its own purchasing. So New York is purchasing, California is purchasing, Illinois is purchasing. We're all trying to buy the same commodity, literally the same exact item. So you have 50 states competing to buy the same item. We all wind up bidding up each other and competing against each other, where you now literally will have a company call you up and say, well, California just outbid you. It's like being on eBay with 50 other states bidding on a ventilator. And you see the bid go up because California bid, Illinois bid, Florida bid, New York bids, California rebids. That's literally what we're doing. I mean, how inefficient. And then FEMA gets involved and FEMA starts bidding. And now FEMA is bidding on top of the 50. So FEMA is driving up the price. What sense does this make?
The economic data at this point indicate we are about to enter a recession, the likes of which we've never seen. Furthermore, our traditional tools, monetary and fiscal policy geared towards stimulating investment and getting people back to work, is literally the opposite of what we need to do right now. So what are we doing? Socialism. Okay, no we're not. But we are doing what the neoliberal storytellers have been deriding as socialism since the fall of the Soviet Union. Namely, we're dumping tons and tons of public money into the economy with the hopes of sustaining it until we can get out of what Paul Krugman aptly refers to as a self-induced economic coma. We're paying workers to stay home. We're paying businesses to keep workers on their payrolls even if they're not working. We're paying companies to keep them stable while people aren't working and consumers aren't spending. Last month, Republicans, government isn't the problem and you can't spend your way out of an economic crisis, Republicans. If the American people have to tighten their belts and the federal government should have to tighten its belt, Republicans, just passed a bipartisan $2 trillion economic aid package. What? Wait a minute. It wasn't more than a few months ago that whenever someone said anything about Medicare for all or the Green New Deal or publicly funded college, the chief criticism was, how are you going to pay for that? Now, we always knew this was a bogus claim. After all, we never asked, how are you going to pay for this massive globally mobilized military? But now in the matter of a couple of weeks, even Republicans are stumbling all over each other to dump $2 trillion into the economy with more to come. Well, how do we pay for that? How about we do that again and get some health care? And that brings us to health care, because access to adequate health care is dependent upon the political economy to make the rules and distribute the resources. Even before the pandemic, it was clear that our health care political economy is simply unsustainable. Costs continue to rise despite the significant reforms of Obamacare. Millions of Americans remain uninsured, a number that's been increasing in the face of an administration hostile to the Affordable Care Act. But now we have a global pandemic for which we were not prepared, and we must address using a healthcare system that wasn't even adequate and was too expensive even under normal conditions. Yet while policy wonks are talking about getting tested and seeing your doctor, millions of Americans are asking, who's going to pay? What if I'm not covered? What if I'm covered but my insurance company won't cover the full cost? What if I lose my job and my insurance goes out the window? Can I even afford to get a diagnosis and miss work even if I suspect I'm sick? Add on top of this our shortages on necessary equipment. I mean, in our country we have so many cell phones we don't know what to do with them. Cell phones in our junk drawers we don't use anymore. But we can't get enough ventilators or face masks? This despite the fact that a health department pandemic drill last year pointed out that these were the very things that were in short supply in the event of a respiratory pandemic? Maybe capitalism isn't the best way to run a healthcare system. And we better figure this out quick, because ours is a global economy. Economic supply chains span the globe in ever more interconnected networks. One thing anyone who studies the history of epidemics can tell you is that diseases follow trade routes. That was true for the Black Plague. It's true today. Except now this fact is even more pressing. In 1918, it took about a week to travel across the Atlantic, let alone the Pacific. Someone with COVID traveling from Hong Kong to San Francisco would have almost certainly been sick upon disembarking and could have been contained. Today, however, my family and I made it from Fort Lauderdale to Beijing in little more than a day, including layovers. Someone with a contagious disease now has plenty of time and opportunity to spread an illness before he even knows he's sick. With the world as integrated as it is today, we're going to see more pandemics, not fewer. We need to be ready, but we're not. Being ready means putting resources, public investments into having things like ventilators and face masks, blood and plasma, and any of a multitude of resources at the ready for free distribution when the next pandemic hits. How are we going to pay for that? Well, maybe some of our priorities might have to change. The fear of terrorism, for instance, has encouraged us to spend $1 trillion a year on this expensive and expansive military-industrial complex. Yet according to projections, COVID stands to kill at least 100,000 Americans this year, with more to come. And as I said earlier, we're going to see more pandemics. The probability of dying from terrorism is orders of magnitude lower than it is for global pandemics, even if those pandemics happen once every 50 years. Maybe some of that money spent on fighting terrorism would be better spent on ventilators. What about environmental policy? I mentioned my friend Sean Munger's video earlier. In his video, he talks about the waters of Venice, notoriously polluted, but now running clear, with even dolphin sightings taking place. We're seeing reports from all over the world. China's providing a valuable natural experiment. When my family and I went to China, our first experience upon leaving the airport in Beijing was being almost knocked over by the smog. Yet as a result of the lockdown, the pollution in China has decreased dramatically. But it's now returning with the return of economic activity. We all know that we have to balance our economic needs with our environmental needs, but COVID is putting the cost of our economic activity and our consumers' culture into stark contrast. Of course, nobody's suggesting that we stay in the house all day to clear the air, but COVID is showing us that changes in our social behavior can have a significant influence on our environmental impact. We have no more than a couple of decades to slow global warming before the consequences are taken out of our hands by Mother Nature. If you think a pandemic is economically and socially catastrophic, what happens when we experience a global ecological collapse? Just a few months ago, acting on global warming seemed daunting, so far-fetched, but now we know that we can change our global footprint if we want to badly enough, and that the Earth has a remarkable capacity to heal if we give it the chance to do so. Healthcare, paid medical leave, a Green New Deal, public investments in education and infrastructure. For years, we've been told that we can't afford these things. There's just no money. It's going to be hard to sustain that story in the face of the billions that magically appeared in order to prop up the shareholders. Look, COVID is going to have an impact on our society. You don't go through something like this without some immediate consequences. Maybe we might see the much talked about COVID baby boom. We may even see a sharp increase in divorces. Certainly there'll be some cultural impacts that will stay with us forever. We'll tell our grandchildren about them. But does that translate into the kind of paradigm shift some are suggesting? Are we seeing the end of neoliberalism or the rise of socialism? Will this result in an entrenchment of the most vile authoritarians and spell doom to democracy? Or will we see a renaissance of democratic humanism and environmental appreciation? Maybe some combination of these things may happen, but we won't wake up after the quarantine is lifted and see a dramatic change. In many ways, we'll be relieved to get our lives back to normal. But COVID will change the stories that we tell about ourselves, and COVID will change the stories institutions use to legitimize themselves. That means any changes we see from COVID will take some time to materialize as institutions shift their motivators and individuals shift their receptiveness to the same old tales versus the new epics. That means that we as individuals have a responsibility to evaluate the stories we're about to be told about how this moment in history is played out. As we know, the stories institutions tell don't have to be true, valid, or reliable. They just have to be an acceptable motivator of human behavior. In the United States and much of the Western world, we have those who have been betrayed by the existing order who share what sociologist Arlie Hochschild refers to as a deep story. Instead of locating their hardships in our corporate-dominated economic structures, they tell a story of a government that gives advantages to the undeserving at the expense of hardworking real Americans. This deep story motivates them to accept a capitalism that exploits them and destroys their environments and denies them access to public goods, while at the same time they cling to a media structure that feeds them a daily diet of righteous indignation. But righteous indignation is no vaccine and will not protect them from coronavirus. The question is, how deep is this story, and can the COVID pandemic dig it out in favor of a more positive story of human progress, connectivity, public investment, and sustainable economies? At this point, I fear that any paradigm shift we might see will hinge on the answer to that question.